This happened on 3 different nights. I never expected that saying yes to listen would change my life. It started as curiosity and ended as a series of choices I still regret. It was the kind of thing you tell yourself could not possibly happen to you until it does. I am 31 and I worked odd hours for a small streaming startup, the kind of job that had me answering emails at midnight and taking trains home with my headphones in. I grew up restless, the kid who wandered toward noise instead of away. I never minded being alone, but I was not prepared for what solitude sounded like when something else answered back. I have never told all of these stories together, and right now I feel the weight of every listening moment pressing on me. Stay with me, because one of these nights almost killed me, and the other two still haunt my dreams. The first story happened in a studio apartment above a laundromat in a neighborhood that smelled like wet cotton and oil. The second took place in a subway car at the end of a late shift when the city felt thin and hollow. The third was at an abandoned community radio station where my friend Mark thought we would find old tapes to sample for a podcast. At the time, my life was ordinary in all the ways that make you vulnerable. I had a landlord named Lewis who collected rent on the second Tuesday of every month and always knocked too long before leaving. My neighbor Jenna played the saxophone badly but loud enough that I could tell when she was happy. I had a girlfriend named Rachel who worked nights as a nurse who always said, "Be careful when you answer the door." My friend Tom drove a beat-up pickup and laughed like it was a second language. Greg, who ran the local coffee shop, gave me free drip when he felt sorry for me. Denise was a producer who hired me for that startup job and believed I had a nose for story. Officer Ramirez interviewed me twice after the second night. Those names matter because each one did something small that nudged the events forward a little, and small choices accumulated like static until the noise shaped events I could not ignore. I will start with the night above the laundromat because it felt like the moment the pattern began. I remember the light from the street lamp leaking through my blinds as I pushed open the door, how the chain on the door rattled under my fingers, and how my phone screen blinked with a voicemail from Rachel. I smelled detergent, metallic, and sweet, and the bass of a TV downstairs thumped through the floor. I had been editing audio for a client and wanted only silence to finish. The first strange sound was a hum, low and steady, not electric, but vocal, like someone singing with their teeth closed. I froze. Then there was a knock at my door, precise and slow. I opened a crack and saw a man with a rain-soaked coat, his face shaded, his mouth moving like he was mouthing a song. He spoke with a voice that could have been tender or threatening, I could not tell. He said my name. He said my name, and that alone pulled every memory of my childhood home into me. He said, "Hey, Jamie, are you awake?" His breath fogged on the glass by the peephole, wet and cold. I asked who it was, and he hesitated, fingers drumming the wood. He said, "I used to live here." I pushed the chain and opened the door wider. He stepped in like he belonged, canceling my space with the smell of damp wool and something metallic, like pennies. His name was Mark, but not my Mark. And then he laughed low and said, "Sorry, I thought this was my old room." I remember saying, "You have the wrong place." And he looked at me with the tilt of his head and dropped a small cassette tape on my table, like an offering. He said, "You listen." I told him I did not have a tape player. He smiled and said, "You can listen to me." He sat on my couch, and before I could decide to be polite or to call someone, I heard him breathe like it was an instrument. Jenna upstairs started playing a long note on her sax, and I realized every sound in the building was stitched to that night. The dialogue that night stretched, 5 exchanges at least, each one a rope pulling me deeper. He said, "Do you remember the patrol car that used to park on 7th? I said I did, my voice small, and I could feel the carpet under my bare feet. He said, "I used things that men left behind," and he tapped the tape on the table, the plastic clicking like teeth. I said, "Who are you really?" And he smiled, "Someone who listens for the lost." I asked him to leave, and he asked if I wanted to hear a story. I said no, and he started talking anyway, telling a story about a neighbor who left a light on and never returned. I could hear his throat close at the end of sentences, the smell of his coat filling the air, the taste of pennies at the back of my mouth. He told me about a bilhete he had found, folded and brittle, addressed to Officer Ramirez, who did not work in our precinct anymore. I felt absurdly calm, and then a rising nausea of wrongness. At some point, I asked for his name again, and he said, "Names are for living people. I am a habit." He left when morning pressed blue through the blinds. I did not call the police. I thought then that it was better not to. Tell Rachel about the man who left tapes. The second story was on the subway a few weeks later, and it started with a written invitation I found stuffed under my apartment door. The note was a thin strip of paper with the words "Dare to Listen" written in a hurried scrawl. No signature, nothing else. I showed it to Greg the next morning, and he said, "Burn it." I kept it instead. That night, my shift at the startup ran late, and Rachel texted that her unit had a shortage and she might be coming home early. I boarded a near-empty car and sat facing a stranger who looked like he had been waiting for me. He had a voice that unfolded like a story and a satchel full of cassette tapes. The subway smelled of old copper and stale breath, the floor sticky with a syrup of spilled drinks, the lights flickering like tired stars. He tapped his fingers on the satchel in a pattern that sounded like Morse, and every time the train hit a gap in the rails, I felt the pattern in my ribs. Dialogue in that car was denser. I did not expect that when I said hello, it would open into a long exchange. He said, "You found the note." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who collects endings." I asked, "What do you want from me?" And he answered, "To tell you stories you cannot unhear." I said, "Why me?" And he said, "Because you listen." He showed me a tape, saying the voice on it had been recorded 2 nights before at an address I recognized as Tom's old house, where Tom used to throw parties. By the time he finished speaking, a woman in the car had stood up and moved to the other end, clutching her bag like a shield. I felt my phone buzz with a message from Denise asking if I could mix a clip tomorrow morning. I told the man I had to get off, and he said, "You will want to bring headphones." The train hissed into the next station, and a uniformed patrol officer walked through the car, looking bored. I told the officer I felt uneasy, and he said, "Keep your head down." That simple sentence felt like permission and betrayal at once. The third story was the worst, and it is the reason I still check the locks. Mark from the first night reappeared in a way I wish he had not. This Mark was someone else entirely. My actual friend Mark texted that he had keys to the old community radio station where they used to broadcast late shows, and he thought we could find tapes to sample. Mark, Tom, and I arrived on a rainy afternoon. The sky smelled of iron, and the floor of the station was dust and old coffee. Lauren, who used to run the station, had a list of records she left in the attic, and she had named a few people to ask, including Rachel, who had once called in to request a song. We met Denise at the stairs, and she said, "Be careful with old equipment." We joked, traded coffee, picked through boxes. The station had a smell of mildew, cassette plastic, and a faint, sweet tang like the memory of syrup. Someone had left a recorder on a table, its red light blinking like a small heart. Inside the station, an exchange unfolded that turned into a slow, sinking tension that lasted long in my spine. We found a reel labeled with my neighborhood and a date. I told Mark to be careful, and he laughed, running his fingers along the edge. I asked him, "What if something in there is meant to stay buried?" He shrugged and said, "Stories do not bite." Tom flipped the recorder on to preview, and a voice came through like someone breathing into a pillow. It sounded wrong because it whispered names, our names, the names of people we had just mentioned. I remember the hairs on my arm lifting, the way the wood felt damp under my palm, the echo of footsteps in the empty hall. The dialogue turned frantic at that point, 6 exchanges at least. I said, "Turn it off." Tom said, "No, it is probably just static." Mark said, "Listen." And the voice on the tape started to list things that had not been said, promises I had never made, confessions I had not whispered. I told Mark to call Rachel. He said, "Her number is not responding." And I realized my phone had no service, as if the building swallowed radios and signals whole. Denise, who had come back down the stairs, pressed her fingertips to her forehead and said, "We should leave."
We moved toward the door and the lights dimmed like someone slowly closing their hand. There is a moment of tension I cannot boil down to less than what it felt like, because it is the part that could have become a headline in the paper. It was long and precise, about 500 to 600 characters in the memory that loops when I close my eyes. The tape clicked, and a voice said, "Everything you threw away was saved." The windows fogged from inside out, and my breath pounded so loud I thought the others must hear it. I remember the smell of damp cardboard and the metallic tang of old batteries, the taste of copper that rose up into my mouth. Tom reached for the recorder with a laugh that was not a laugh, and when he grabbed it, the recorder played a sound like someone scratching fingernails across an old vinyl. The door swung shut behind us without wind, and I felt the weight of being caught. My hand searched for the doorknob, and the knob was cold and slick, as if someone had washed it with oil. The voice on
The tape said our names and said where we would be found. For a beat, everything was sound and nothing was sight. I remember thinking I could count on the police to come, to make a file, to run a patrol and find answers. I also remember the sickening realization that if I called, if I made a report, I would draw attention to the things that had been said. I told myself we could leave without telling anyone, and that choice sat in my chest like a stone. We did not tell, at first. We stumbled into the rain like people who tried to forget a nightmare by walking through it. Outside, Officer Ramirez was on a routine patrol, and she stopped to ask if we were all right because a neighbor had called to report the building lights flickering. I lied and said it was nothing but an electrical fault. She asked for our names, and I gave mine, and she wrote it on a notepad with a careful slant. I saw the pen move across the paper and the word patrol on the outer pages of her booklet, and thought about how words on paper could either summon help or seal a story into a file no one read. Later that night, I dreamed of cassette tape spoolings like intestines and woke with the smell of tape glue in my mouth. About a week after the station, headlines began to appear that stitched the nights together in ways I could not have predicted. A short article about a missing person in a suburb I recognized. A correction on the local news about a disturbance at the abandoned station. A blotter entry in the police report filed by Officer Ramirez that mentioned an unauthorized entry and possible vandalism. The word investigation appeared, and friends forwarded me messages asking if I knew anything. Denise called and asked if I had turned any tapes over to anyone. I told her no, and she said, "You should give them to me. Like that would keep the stories from multiplying." The paper had a small photograph of the station and a caption that said the patrol had recovered artifacts that might be evidence, which felt at once like relief and accusation. I sat on my couch and listened to silence like it might answer me. The police did come, eventually, to interview Tom and me more formally, and the process felt clinical. They asked for a written statement about times and sounds and names, and we offered halting details. Officer Ramirez was patient, asking about patterns and possible suspects and writing in her notebook, which had the word patrol printed on the top of each page. She said they would open a file, run a peritia on any physical media, check logs for the patrol cars in our neighborhood. Her voice was steady and professional, and for a while I believed that the system could contain whatever had spilled into my life. But there was a deeper problem than evidence. There was the way guilt nested in me from choices I had made. I had not called immediately. I had not forced the issue when Mark first left the tape at my apartment. I had let curiosity trump caution when the man in the train with the satchel asked me to listen. When headlines asked if anyone had information, I felt the pull of the old instinct to stay quiet. I kept thinking, who would believe that voices on old tapes said things that had not been said aloud, that a man could appear at my door like a memory? I regretted not telling Rachel everything. I regretted not bringing the tape to Greg, who might have looked at it with a technical eye. I felt complicit in a slow unraveling. Those are the heavy, private things that do not make the evening news, but that shape the way a person moves through life after. At about 33% through this confessional, I want to pause to ask you a question because it matters to me and to others. If you ever find a note under your door that simply says, "Dare to listen," would you throw it away or put it in your pocket?
If you have a strange voice at your door who insists you stay and tell stories that unsettle you, do you call someone or pretend you did not hear? If you have ever felt that need to keep something small and terrifying to yourself, write starting with the phrase, "in my time," and tell us what happened. Your comment could be a small lifeline to someone who is deciding whether to speak up or remain silent. Share the simplest detail you remember so a pattern might be seen. I read every comment, and sometimes I don't answer, but I always read. Now back to the nights. The backstory I have avoided because it felt irrelevant when I was younger becomes painfully relevant now. I grew up in a house that kept secrets in drawers and under mattresses. My mother made lists and my father crossed things off. And if you asked him about the things he had crossed out, he would say life was better managed with less detail. I learned early to listen because listening made me feel included. By the time I was a teenager, I was the person friends came to, with keys and with a shoulder. I worked a job in radio for a while where I learned how to splice tapes and edit voices. That job taught me the seductive power of recorded sound and the way a voice could be framed to be something it was not. In college, I took a class on folklore and we studied how rumors moved through neighborhoods. I learned that stories want to be told and that sometimes telling them makes them more dangerous. In my 20s, I lost a friend to a mistake. I could not reverse. And since then, I had a habit of assuming silence was less harmful than scandal. I believed for a long time that the world had a margin where small things could be kept. That belief is why I did not go to the police immediately when I should have. It is why I kept tapes for longer than I should have kept them. And it is why, even now, months later, the taste of metal in the back of my throat when I think of those nights feels like a rebuke. Those paragraphs are the pieces of my life that make the choices I made logically awful and painfully human. 3 months after the last of the nights, things shifted into clear daylight. The station had been searched more thoroughly by forensic technicians who referred to their work as paresia and left a checklist on the table for Officer Ramirez to sign. They found several physical artifacts, including a reel with my neighborhood's name scrawled across the spool and a number of cassette tapes with no labels. I sat in a room with a metal table under a bright lamp and watched as a technician named Gregor explained the process in clipped sentences. He said they would check for fingerprints, for spliced edits, for traces of another's DNA. He handled the tapes like museum pieces, his gloves whispering on the plastic. Denise walked me through making a formal statement to the detective assigned to the case, and she said, "If they have anything connected to you, let it be in the record." I had hesitated before, and she had pushed, and for that I felt a complex gratitude and anger. The patrol logs confirmed that there had been calls about lights flickering at the station, and the file had a brief note from Officer Ramirez that she had seen 3 men leaving in a pickup truck. Tom's name was in the report as a witness, and he sat across from me, looking smaller than usual. The investigation gained momentum because when things became official, other people found it easier to tell. News outlets ran a small story, and one local radio host said the phrase, "dare to listen" on air, and thousands of ears leaned in like birds. 1 month after the worst night, the first concrete consequence arrived. A neighbor found a box in a dumpster behind the laundromat that contained a stack of old cassettes and a journal. The police dossier labeled the cassettes as evidence, and the journal was sent to the forensics lab. The journal contained names and small sketches of places, notes about who left early and who did not. It mentioned the patrol routes in my neighborhood, sometimes in the margin, which made Officer Ramirez frown when she read it. She called me into the station to ask about particular entries that matched details of nights I had lived through. The feeling of being summoned to a place where other people had power to name and analyze the chaos was at once comforting and deeply exposing. I told her everything I remembered, and she took my statement and cross-referenced it with the tape logs. The community started to speak more openly. Greg closed his shop for one evening to let people leave notes on a board he taped to his window. People wrote small things: a song on a late-night radio show, a light left on, a man who was seen only once and smelled like pennies. Those notes formed a pattern. It was not a tidy justice, but it was a communal attempt to map what happened. I stopped sleeping through the hours when Jenna played the sax, because now every sound felt like a clue. 3 months later, there was a public update. The district attorney announced they were reviewing the evidence and that a file had been opened on multiple unauthorized entries to former broadcast locations. A short segment on the local morning show quoted Officer Ramirez and mentioned the Parisha results, which suggested some of the tape edits were crude and possibly archival. The news used the word investigation often and used it like a rope to pull the story into daylight. That publicity created pressure. Tom received a subpoena to share any recordings he had kept, and he complied, grumbling but precise. Mark, the friend with the keys, testified that he had not taken any tapes out intentionally, and that he had given a small batch to a collector who lived in the next county. That collector turned out to be a man named Lewis, who had a basement filled with dozens of tapes, each labeled with dates and brief descriptions. The police found that a few of the tapes contained recordings that matched the voices from the other nights. It was not the tidy resolution we might have wanted, but it was movement toward accountability. People debated on radio shows whether a voice on a tape could be a person or a performance, and that debate made me feel small and big at the same time. I felt small because in the public square, my fear became an argument, and big because the argument forced authorities to act. 6 months later, the longer consequences were visible in the neighborhood and in my life. Officer Ramirez had been promoted to a desk assignment, and she came by the coffee shop to tell me there would be routine patrols around the community stations and laundromats. Patrols had increased on weekend nights, and volunteers organized to sit with lights on in the abandoned station to discourage trespassers. The community filed a complaint with the local council, asking for better lighting around the blocks where old institutions stood empty. The DA called to say they had enough to bring a misdemeanor charge related to trespassing and illegal recording for a man named Lewis, who claimed he collected tapes for preservation. The charge was not the dramatic arrest I had feared, but it was something textured and public. Personally, I stopped taking the late trains. Rachel insisted, and it became a small ultimatum. I accepted because I owed her honesty, and because the nights had hollowed out a margin of fear I did not want to expand. I moved my editing setup into the daytime, when the world felt less thin. The station was sealed, and classes on community radio archives were offered at the local library. People who had kept their mouths shut began to speak, and their voices created a network of small protections. There are lessons here I want to leave you with, because confession without direction is just a string of fearful things. First, listening is not neutral. When you decide to listen to something that is meant to unsettle you, you decide in that moment whether you will document, whether you will share, whether you will turn a private fear into a public record. Second, silence is often chosen out of shame or the thought that you will be seen as silly. That thought will cost other people. Third, institutions move slowly, but they move, and the difference between private terror and public action is sometimes the courage to file a simple report. I regret not calling sooner, because small actions can form a patrol of care if enough people do them. If you are watching this and you keep quiet because you think no one will believe you, write it down. If you find a note under your door called "Dare to Listen," bring it to a friend and tell them immediately. Talk to someone like Officer Ramirez, who will write the words down and make a file. Shared fear loses power. If this story made your skin crawl, consider subscribing for more accounts like this one. Here, we tell true stories and talk about what to do when the strange enters your life. If you want to hear more, hit the subscribe button. And one last thing that stays with me like a small bruise of truth, remember that listening can be brave, and it can be dangerous. And sometimes the bravest thing is not to hear everything, but to make a choice to ask for help.